Here we go. Well, you know Jeanne, but let's see. Pistole is right here. Right there. And you know Jeanne. Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Clark Irvin said he's been working too hard, and I should do this introduction. I'm Walter Isaacson, president of the Aspen Institute, former colleague of Jeanne Meserve. And so let me invite you all in to take your seats. It'll be one of the most interesting of panels. I had a great pleasure of working with Jeanne because she is a very straightforward, smart, intelligent journalist. But the problem I had working at CNN is the same problem I think John has in his life, is that wherever he goes, people give him a piece of advice. You know, like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? I think other than being Anthony Weiner's press secretary or Rupert Murdoch's governance committee chair, being head of the TSA is one of those tough jobs where you get far too much advice. I will say that I've heard John before on panels, and I've heard him talk, and it is really good to get somebody with a smart, commonsensical take who also knows how to balance common sense with our values as a nation. And so we're in for a great pleasure. Thank you, Jeanne, and thank you, John, for doing this.
Thank you, Walter, for that introduction. Administrator Pistole has been at the helm of the TSA for 1 year now, and I might mention today is his wedding anniversary, celebrating with us.
My wife's also.
That's true.
That's right.
That's true. And Walter, I do have one problem. He poured some water, and he poured more than 3 ounces. So can we just?
So moving on. So I'm just curious if I could interject here.
Certainly.
So if you had a negative experience with TSA in coming to Aspen, just a show of hands, please. Okay, there's a handful. If you don't mind stepping out of the room, and I'll talk to you afterwards. We'll see you go from there. So.
And as I told the administrator, I had an exceptionally positive interaction with the TSA on my way here.
Glad to hear that, Jeanne.
We know that many of your employees are doing a good job. But we also know that there are some problems with some of the others, and we'll get to that. I just want to mention 26 years with the FBI's incredible background in intelligence and in law enforcement. At the FBI, was involved in investigations of some key aviation events like the liquid plot in London and also the Christmas Day bombing, and eventually rose to be deputy director of the FBI before coming over to the FBI. As is befitting someone from the Hoosier State, he is a basketball player and played a very key role when his high school team went to the state championships, right?
I had a great seat watching this terrific team because,
Okay. And also, I just wanted to warn you about one thing that was left off my bio, which is that I did take a one-day course in recognizing microfacial expressions.
Oh, good.
This is the training that Mr. Pistole's behavior detection officers go through to detect deception. So you're on notice here.
There we go.
Okay. We've been talking in the last couple of sessions about the macro view of Homeland Security and national security. I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's start with a case of Thomas Sawyer. Thomas Sawyer is the guy who had a urostomy bag, had a very rough pat down at a checkpoint, ended up covered in urine. You called him, you brought him to Washington to talk with your people, and yet a couple of days ago at the same airport, he says he again got a very rough pat down from a TSA officer. What's up with that?
So the challenge, Jeanne, is that we deal with approximately 1.8 million people every day. And the goal is obviously to provide the best possible security in the most professional way. Most times that happens, sometimes it doesn't. So when I spoke with Mr. Sawyer around Christmas time, he explained in more detail what had happened, and it was not as bad as had been reported. His point was that he wanted to explain to the security officer what his situation was, but the security officer said, no, you don't have to tell me about that. He was wanting to, and so the dynamic was the security officer saying, or the security officer's background was, do not pry into people's personal lives as it relates to their physical situation.
But this time he says he tried to tell the officer what his situation was, and the officer didn't want to hear it. This presumably after you'd done some retraining on this whole issue, particularly at that airport.
So we have done additional training, and part of the challenge is the retraining, and as people come into situations that may be unique for them, how best to engage, recognizing that the threats are real, and what people are looking for are those opportunities that the bad guys that we've been hearing about in Mike's and Eric's discussions previously, how those external medical devices could be used in a bad way. And so the professional interaction is something that we work on daily, and we have thousands of people in similar situations who go through with a positive experience.
Despite your very positive poll here in this room, a lot of people have had experiences with rude officers, with belligerent officers, with inconsistent advice. But more importantly, there have been instances where threats have gotten through your checkpoints. Very recently, there was this individual who twice got through TSA checkpoints with an invalid boarding pass. So how do you upgrade this workforce? How do you make it better?
So part of the challenge is how do we make sure that we are looking for those things that can cause catastrophic failure to an aircraft, first and foremost, and can we make sure that those people, for example, who have false ID, how can we do a better job of preparing our officers to make that determination? The good news out of that is, though, even though the two individuals you mentioned did go through the document checker, and we dropped the ball. We should have caught those. They still went through the same physical screening that everybody else did, and so they did not pose a threat to civil aviation.
Yeah, but you guys took over that document checking from the airlines because you believed you could do it better. And twice this guy got through.
So again, I think context is important. So we're not perfect. We do make mistakes. The question is, with the multiple layers of security that we have in place, do we have a single point of failure that could lead to catastrophic failure on an aircraft? And the whole goal is to ensure that as we move to more of a risk-based, intelligence-driven approach, that we do not have a single point of failure. So even though somebody did get on an aircraft without the proper identification and a fake boarding pass or old boarding pass, that person still went through that physical screening.
Does unionization help you or hurt you as you try to improve your workforce?
As I've gone around and done town halls with airports around the country, I've heard from the frontline officers about some of their frustrations with lack of consistency and uniformity. For example, in things of how they bid on a shift or what uniform they're allowed to wear, variations, things like that. I think the collective bargaining, simply at the national level, no local collective bargaining, will help in things completely unrelated to the security aspects, which, given the broad authorities under the Aviation Transportation Security Act that created TSA, gave the administrator those broad discretion, say, here's what would be subject to collective bargaining if we decide to allow the officers vote, and here's what not. So I completely excluded any security aspects.
Okay, and security is what's important about this. You look at the current requirements for a TSA officer, and I believe, according to what I found on the web, high school diploma, a GED, or 1 year of work experience in the security field. In other words, somebody who's worked at a front desk as a security guard for a year can become one of your officers. Do you need to change those qualifications? Do you need to be bringing people perhaps with more education into these jobs?
So obviously there's what Congress authorized in the enabling legislation, and what was created was to address an immediate need. So TSA did, and everybody involved in that process, once the enabling legislation was signed in November of 2001, literally over 50,000 people were hired in basically a 6-month period, and then deployed, given training and deployed. As we build toward a new future, I think there will be many more opportunities for people that will be involved in other types, have different educational backgrounds, work experiences, that really help in that continuing professionalization of the workforce.
But this is the minimum standard.
That's the minimum
standard. Do you
standard.
need to make it higher?
So that's something we have started discussions on and looked at. I don't think many people realize that almost 25%, and even more so in some airports, of the workforce were part-time. And that's an efficiency equation, because you, just in rush hour in driving, you have a morning rush hour, they call it the morning bank, and the afternoon bank, so these rush hours. And so rather than paying somebody to be on from 5 in the morning until 7 at night with overtime and everything, we have a large force that comes in and works the morning, and then maybe they'll do a split shift, but many do not. And so part of it is the part-time aspect of it, and the qualifications and the long-term prospects. So we're looking at a number of things, but the bottom line being there are some immensely talented security officers. We are a cross-section of society in many ways. Everyone does come to work each day, though, to make sure that they can do everything possible to keep something bad from happening on an aircraft, to protect you and your loved ones as you travel.
What does it tell you about the regard in which your workforce is held, that a woman came up to one of your officers and physically touched the officer?
Well, it's very disappointing to me, because here are people, government employees, whose job is to protect the traveling public as they fly. And so when somebody assaults, and we can call it nice things or other things, but when somebody assaults a security officer, as happened recently in this incident you mentioned, it causes me great concern, because if people feel like they want to assault security officers because they don't like the screening protocol, then what does that say about where we are and what we want to be doing? And to the people who would want to do that, I would encourage them to find some other means of transportation or do something so they would not feel like they would want to assault a security officer.
So you say it may say something about where we are. What's your assessment?
Well, to think that somebody feels like they have license, if you will, to assault a security officer and not have any consequences, any repercussions either civilly or criminally, I think is just a sad commentary.
One of those layers of security that you've talked about are behavior detection officers. They're the people who survey the crowd and look for something that may look suspicious. There have been reports that on multiple occasions people linked to terrorist events have passed through airports, have not been detected. GAO did a report in which they said there's no scientific basis for believing that BDOs work. You still believe they work?
I do. Given my years of experience at the FBI, I believe behavior detection used properly can be a valuable layer in those multiple layers of security. I would note that the report that was done citing that terrorists have gotten past behavior detection officers, those terrorists I'm very familiar with from my FBI background. None were what we would describe as bomb throwers. These were fundraisers, these are businessmen particularly, who were going to raise money. So it's a whole different construct than somebody who may be a suicide bomber who is ready to pull the plug and blow themselves up either at a checkpoint or if they got through, such as Abdul Muttalib on Christmas Day '09, to try to blow up the plane. So it's a different construct. In that vein, I'm very much interested in expanding the behavior detection program, upgrading, if you will, in a way that allows us to have more interaction with a passenger just from a discussion, which may be able to expedite the physical screening aspects. So we've looked at what works around the world, some outstanding examples, and we are planning to do some new things in the near future here, which I'll be able to announce publicly probably next month. So
no more detail here. This is more or less the Israeli model, right? You engage in a
there's
conversation.
a lot, yes, a lot that under that Israeli model, a lot that is done that is obviously very effective.
Pat downs of children and the elderly, another area where you guys have really taken some knocks. I know you were looking at ways to modify pat downs for kids. Have you gotten anywhere on that?
So we have, and being very aware, cognizant of how terrorists can use children. As we know, there have been 2 10-year-olds around the world used by terrorists as suicide bombers, not in aviation. And then just in the last month, unfortunately, an 8-year-old girl in Afghanistan that the Taliban gave a package to deliver, and she unwittingly was used as a suicide bomber. So I'm not concerned about the children with intent or anything like that. I'm concerned about an adult using that child in a bad way, just as we see adults using children as drug couriers, unfortunately, or money couriers, because of the belief that they will not receive the same type of scrutiny. That being said, using a risk-based, intelligence-driven approach, I think we can do a different way of screening the children that recognizes that in the very high likelihood they do not have a bomb on them. And so we have been exploring ways to do that, and we'll again be announcing something probably next month. We'll actually be doing proofs of concept in several airports starting fairly soon. So as opposed to a major announcement, I want to see how these work, and then we will look to expand that nationwide in hopefully the not too distant future.
So presumably somewhere down the road, we're no longer going to see those YouTube videos of 6-year-olds at the New Orleans airport getting a pat down?
So the one point about that is anytime we talk about doing, for example, a across-the-board exclusion to say no more pat downs if you are X years of old or this old, as soon as I publish something like that, I'm very concerned about terrorists trying to exploit that as a vulnerability. That being said, I think under our new protocols, we would see very few, for example, pat downs of children. But I always want to keep random and unpredictable in the process. So terrorists can't game a system. They say, okay, there's a very high likelihood that this child will not receive a pat down or this elderly person. So I want to make sure we always keep random and unpredictable in there to that end.
And you're going to have to resolve any alarms that come up.
Sure. So, so if we can't resolve alarm, and obviously we'll involve the parent or guardian if it's a child in a new and expanded way, which might take longer. So people, if you have opportunities for different lanes and you see a family and there's a number of folks,
go somewhere else.
You might want to look someplace else because we will be spending more time in order to resolve an alarm. The bottom line is if we have to be able to resolve an alarm in some fashion before we allow people to get on a plane.
What about the elderly? Any modifications there?
So we're looking at options there also. And Mike and others in the room could tell you about the number of people at certain age levels. So we've done quite a bit of analysis of those, for example, on the TSDB, the terrorism, the database. And I think most people outside of this room, probably some inside this room, would be shocked at the number of people, and just fill in the age, who are on that list. So it's more problematic with ages, but there are certain things that I think we can do in a more informed fashion to facilitate that screening.
AIT machines, the body imaging machines, you've now gone to a different software. You're beginning to roll that out, which is allaying the fears of some privacy advocates. But within the month, you have put out information about a different kind of threat, which is implanting explosives. It's often been discussed that terrorists could insert explosives into their body. Would those machines detect explosives that are either implanted or inserted in someone's body?
So I can give a definitive, it depends. Obviously what the advanced imaging technology machines look for are external anomalies. So if it is exclusively a surgically implanted device that somehow would be accessed, whether through a syringe or something that somebody a diabetic could be carrying or something, that would be very challenging. So that's why we have the multiple layers of security to look at all the possibilities. And let me just say, the best layer of security we have is what's been talked about in the previous two sessions, and that's intelligence. So the best opportunity we have to prevent a terrorist from getting on a plane, either coming to the U.S. or from one of the 450 airports here in the U.S., is intelligence. So we always know about the strategic intelligence that Al-Qaeda, related groups, TTP, you name it, they want to do something bad to us. That's fine. What we're looking for is the tactical intelligence, like we saw with the Yemen cargo plot, where because of great human intelligence provided by the Saudi Mabahith, that they said, here's a tracking number on these two packages with the toner cartridge bombs in them. That's the best layer of defense we have. If we don't have that intelligence, then I hope my colleagues at the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, identify somebody here. That may not happen either, but then we have almost 800,000 state and local police officers, sheriff's deputies. Hopefully they will be aware of something, either through a traffic stop or something else. That may not happen, so then hopefully we have concerned citizens who see something, say something, just out of a point of vigilance, not about anything else. But that may not happen, so then we literally may have an Abdul Muttalib, a Christmas Day type bomber, who gets to, let's say, the Aspen, Pitkin County Airport here, and goes up and has no metallic device on them. Many of our airports don't have the advanced image technology. So the risk and the challenge we have is that person could exploit our vulnerabilities and go through a checkpoint that has a walk-through metal detector and have no anomalous behavior issues and does not alarm, so there would not be a pat-down unless it's, again, one random unpredictable. That person gets on a plane. That's our challenge. So these multiple layers of defense that we have, based on intelligence, is the best point, and then from there, so really TSA is the last line of defense. Maybe there's federal air marshals on board, but I don't think it's any revelation that probably not on a small regional jet from Aspen to some other place. So,
but getting back to the machine for a minute, the intelligence is often imperfect, but what you have here is a threat that has evolved. So is it worth the investment of almost $200,000 per AIT machine when it's not going to be able to catch what you now know you're looking for?
So we have to use the best opportunities we have at the time. We can always hope for some other technology and not do anything about it. So what AIT, the Advanced Image Technology, gives us the best opportunity to detect the non-metallic devices, the bombs, that Abdul Muttalib and others, the assassination attempt against Mohammed bin Nayef in the kingdom, saying bomb maker, as we all know. So how can we best position ourselves? And that's why I want to expand behavior detection, because hopefully somebody who is a suicide bomber would have some manifestation, as opposed to these fundraisers who are just going about doing business. And so that gives us the best opportunity.
So right now, what do we have to detect implanted explosives? Can dogs pick it up?
So it depends. Obviously, I don't want to go into too much detail in terms of providing a roadmap to anybody, but obviously there's a number of opportunities. A canine may pick it up, depending on...
Are you training them to do that?
So they're already trained for, obviously, any specific types of explosives, and depending on where it would be, the explosive trace detection of the hands, if that bomber, putative bomber, had touched anything that would be picked up. Again, there may be something else. There may be an external device that would be used to initiate that. Hopefully we would pick that up as something suspicious. So there are a number of opportunities, but it's not a foolproof system. There's no 100% guarantee in this business. And as we move forward with a risk-based security approach, I think we need to try to get away from saying, look, this is a 100% guarantee in this business. That what we in TSA are in the business of is risk mitigation and risk management. And the better cooperation we can have with the traveling public, the better informed the traveling public can be what we're looking for, again, without publishing all the details. So just an aside here. So we know that terrorists look at our websites, they look at the manufacturers of our technology, their websites, to look at all their detection capabilities. Very specific information in some instances. So they're going to school on our very open society. So what I don't want to do is say anything that would add to that from a policy approach.
Here's a non-security question about AIT machines. You say they've been tested, but there's a group of scientists, some of them, all of them, I think, members of the National Academy of Sciences, who still say the machines are not safe, that you have not done adequate testing on the radiation levels. Why not do that testing and allay the public's fears and silence them?
So there's been multiple testing that's been done, and I'm not a scientist, so I rely on those scientists and those institutions that have done that testing well before the first machine was ever deployed. And I think people realize there's two types of machines, and the one is of more concern to some than others. And those machines have been tested, and the equivalency that I've been told is you get the same amount of radiation exposure in going through an AIT as 3 minutes of flight at elevation. So if you're on a cross-country flight, 5 hours, you figure out how many times you'd have to go through AIT. So I just rely on the scientists. I'm open to additional scientific studies. I frankly don't want to pay for them, but I'm glad for somebody else to pay for them and come in and do those studies because I have full faith and confidence that they are safe.
Okay, well, these scientists say there hasn't been independent testing and there hasn't been the same kind of testing that there is, for instance, for medical devices that are deployed for the general public. So if you want someone to pick up the tab, maybe you'll get some
I'm open
offers
to that.
here.
There you
Maybe
go.
we'll see. You mentioned our friends, the federal air marshals. They're a rowdy bunch. One member of Congress said there have been more air marshals arrested than the number of people arrested by air marshals. You're spending about $200 million per arrest, according to his calculations, arrest by air marshals of other people. So can the U.S. afford to continue this program?
So I think it presents a policy option, and we can say, okay, let's save $200 million and have no federal air marshals. And so where does that impact us in terms of layers of security? So from a risk-based approach, you could say, okay, let's save some money here, and what risk does that expose us to? So that's a good public policy debate. I am obviously a strong proponent of having federal air marshals on board in case all those other layers that I mentioned do not work. And so it is literally the last line of defense. Most people know there are a number of pilots who are armed that we train, that they volunteer and we train them. So that's another possibility, but that's random from standpoint of they're just on their flight. So we try to assign our federal air marshals based on risk and intelligence. And so every day I start my morning, and senior leadership team does, with an intel brief, similar to what I had at the FBI. With this obviously being a transportation focus, and I have a 72-hour look ahead to say where are those who are selectees from the TSDB, or clear the no-flies who want to fly and won't be, hopefully. What flights are they on? And so I can actually move Federal Air Marshal assignments around to say, I want to make sure we have FAM coverage on that flight because there's a selectee on that flight. So that's a result of technology innovation and the implementation of what's known as secure flight, which became fully operational last fall. So that's a good intelligence-driven option and opportunity for us. As you notice, I don't respond to the first part of your question.
About them being a rowdy bunch. Right. Yeah. Trusted traveler. You launched a pilot, the idea being that people are pre-screened to determine if they're low risk, and then they will get some benefit in the screening process. But you haven't as yet divulged many details about the balance here between the convenience and privacy. What are people going to have to tell you in order to be part of this program? Will they be fingerprinted? Will you be looking at credit histories? Will they undergo, let's say, a law enforcement background check?
So there's two aspects to this as we move forward with a risk-based security approach. And whether you call it a trusted traveler, known traveler, we've had some good discussion and debate about that among many in the community. The key is to take those that we know something about because they volunteered information. So as far as the privacy, civil liberty issues, if somebody doesn't want to be considered for the possibility of expedited physical screening, that's fine. Just stand in line, do your normal thing. I don't want to collect any additional information from somebody who doesn't want to share that. So that's the first point. The second is for those who are part of the Customs Border Protection Global Entry Program, they've already volunteered information. They've gone through a background check, had an interview, fingerprints and things. So those are a good starting point for us. Say we know something about them. The likelihood that they are terrorists is much lower than the general population. So that's an immediate group that we will be doing a proof of concept starting in September with in certain airports. The other group that we look at, and many people in this room would qualify, I would think, would be in the higher tiers, the elite tiers of the frequent flyer programs. So if you are a businesswoman or a businessman who's been traveling for X number of years, you fill in the blank how long you've been traveling, and you are willing to share the information that your airline has on you, for example, just what your travel history is, how long you've been, not your credit card information. I don't want any of that. In fact, I don't want to take any of that information. I simply want to ping against what the airline has and basically a binary of saying, yes, they are at this tier, or no. So initially, it will be limited information. as people are willing, as the initiative matures, then we'll look at the more data we have, the richer picture we can have of what are the possibilities, recognizing there's no guarantees.
With those frequent flyer participants, will they get a law enforcement background check?
Not initially. So, and there will not be a biometric requirement. So the first iteration of this, and it will be a long-term build, but the first iteration is something where there will be no fees required, there will be no additional information that is required in terms of rulemaking that I would have to do with the public, in terms of comments and that. This is something that I can do that is budget neutral, that doesn't require somebody to pay a fee to do something, and I see the benefits of that later on, but at least in this first iteration, I want to make sure that we have some baseline coupled with the global entry program to say, yes, we need to recognize people. There's all kinds of people, many in this room, for example, who have a top secret security clearance. So why, using a risk-based approach, why do we treat them the same as somebody who we know nothing about other than name, date of birth, and gender, which is in secure flight? So those are some other options we're looking at.
So someone signs up, they become a participant, what's the benefit?
So they don't actually sign up other than to say they consent. The airline, some of you, I'm curious, has any of you received an email from your airline saying that whether you'd like to have more information about this? Okay, so there's at least a few. So I think the airlines will be, starting off, we have two airlines that we are starting with, American and Delta. So the benefits would be, at least in the four the airports that we are doing the proof of concept, there will be a dedicated lane that the person, if they have gone through this acknowledgement, they don't mind their information being shared, then they would have a dedicated lane that they could go to, and then embedded on their boarding pass would be information that they are in this known or low risk category. We'll then have scanners at the checkpoint to say, okay, this person is a known or low risk, and so in all likelihood, they would be able to receive the benefit, for example, keeping their shoes on, perhaps keeping their laptop in their briefcase. Those would be initial things, so lower what we call divestment issues. The other part of it is then that we'll still keep the random and unpredictable. So even though Jeanne Meserve has traveled the last 9 times as a frequent traveler and received that benefit, it may be on the 10th time that you need to keep your shoes off, you need to take your shoes off and take your laptop out.
And theoretically, then you'd catch some people, perhaps clean skins, who are trying to exploit the program.
That's the idea.
But you're only doing random screening. And with the Sentry program, which is sort of the Customs and Border Protection version of this, where people get expedited access across the borders, they have found people who are participants in the program who are carrying drugs. And so they found some who definitely are taking advantage, and they don't know how many they haven't caught that are taking advantage. That's a risk for you. This is a gamble.
It is, and so as with any approach that involves taking on risks, is a question of where do the risks and security balance. And so the key is going back to intelligence, and the more we can know about somebody, the better judgments and decisions we can make, recognizing that's not foolproof. Look, I worked with Robert Hansen at the FBI. He turned out to be a spy for the Soviets and later the Russians. We know about Major Hassan, obviously, so not only a medical doctor, a major. So there are no guarantees in any given population that somebody may not break bad, if you will. But the more information we have and the better job we can do of having information ahead of time, I think the better judgments we can make at a checkpoint to say, okay, and obviously the behavior detection, the reason I'm supporting that strongly is because I think that will be one of the key parts. Canines, obviously, so somebody who goes through this expedited screening, there may be a canine on the other side that would be able to simply, they have to walk by. So there's a number of different things in these layers of security that we want to make sure the terrorists are not exploiting the system.
We're going to get to questions in a minute, but I have to ask you, of course, about the current threat picture. Earlier this month, as we've discussed, you talked about the possibility of implanted explosives. Do you have any additional information about that? Is there something new that's emerging in the aviation realm?
So that is the surgically implanted devices is simply the latest iteration of what we see the evolving threat, whether from AQ, AQAP, TTP, whichever terrorist group fill in the blank. We recognize that they are determined, that they are creative in their design of devices, as we saw with the toner cartridges, with the underwear bomb, and that they are innovative in how they conceal. So those are all challenges. I won't go into any more detail in terms of the latest intelligence, but it is a real threat, and it is something that we are very much focused on, not only here in the U.S., but with our international partners, recognizing the vulnerabilities that we have in aviation and recognizing the high value that terrorists place on aviation, both commercial airliners, but also the cargo airliners.
We've talked a little bit in the previous sessions about where the threat is emanating from. In the aviation sphere, you've got a tougher nut to crack, don't you? Because even though the plot might be hatched in Yemen or Somalia, it could be launched anywhere in the world, correct?
Correct.
So international cooperation becomes absolutely key. How do you get the kind of international cooperation you need? How do you guarantee that they are truly screening passengers' cargo to the levels that you want them to see? You can't dictate.
So, well, we can dictate in some respects. Anything coming to the U.S., we have standards that we say, unless you meet these standards, we won't allow, whether it's cargo or passengers, come. And so, for example, with the Yemen cargo plot, 5 days after that was discovered, I was in Sana'a, Yemen, to meet with the Yemeni authorities to say, okay, what are you doing specifically? And also looking at the insider threat. So even though they may be doing some good x-ray and they had very basic equipment, so we provided through State Department some additional screening equipment. We sent a team in to do training of their security officers. We still have the insider threat any place that we are concerned about. But the issue becomes then, have they met this baseline level for anything that would come? We put an immediate ban on any cargo coming out of Yemen, right, of course. And so we try to work very closely with our partners, and not just in the civil aviation and security business, but in the intel community, in the law enforcement community, and of course recognizing that each airline has their vested interest in making sure that they are doing everything humanly possible, enabled by the best technology, to keep bad things from getting on flights. So the bottom line is we have applied a very focused approach, particularly as it relates to cargo, looking at high-risk cargo. And so, for example, the woman in Sana'a who brings the toner cartridges, okay, so we need to do more vetting. Let's not let that fly, what she has. But the Fortune 500 companies, the worldwide companies that do business globally, they have good global supply chain security, and in most instances, so what we do is work with them, and frankly, on some advanced targeting information. So what do they know about the company? What do they know about their supply chain and things like that?
Great. I would love to open this up to some questions. And we do have microphones here. If I call on you, please wait for the microphone to get to you. Please identify yourself and then launch away with a question. I believe I saw someone with a hand up right over here in the jacket.
And any questions you have for Jeanne, I'm sure she'd be glad to take also.
Hi, John. My name is Jeremy Simon. I come out of industry. My company provides very specialized X-ray technology for explosive detection. I know you're not a scientist, as you mentioned. Is there any specific technology you're excited about in terms of countering some of the threats you're seeing? And I'd also like to know, from a personal vantage point, do you see the same level of investment or motivation for investment in developing next generation imaging technology, as an example, for helping counter some of these threats? Certainly there's some fiscal issues going on in Washington that affect funding, and I wonder how you feel about funding for your department over the next period of time.
So let me take those three parts and kind of wrap it into one and say some of you have heard about and are proponents of what's known as the checkpoint of the future. The International Air Travel Association, IATA, has been a strong proponent of that, which is basically a futuristic, based on intelligence, what we know about people. You go into one of three lanes, and if you're in the low-risk lane, then there's minimal divestment of what you may have, medium lane for everybody else, and then the known travelers, those at very low risk. You basically walk through a tunnel of truth, if you want, something where it would be able to pick up explosives based on different detection capability. We're not there yet. That's something of the future. That's why they call it checkpoint of the future. I think that's something to pursue in private industry, something so you could keep liquids, you could keep everything on you, including your carry-on bag, but by walking through this tunnel of sensors, or this checkpoint of sensors, theoretically it could pick something up like that. So that's, I won't go into more detail in terms of just acquisition things, but just that would be something that we'd be very much interested in.
Tom Frank, right here.
Hi, John. Tom Frank. I want to ask you about the Trusted Traveler Program. You seem to just acknowledge yourself that it's not going to be perfect and that people could defeat it. And it seems that once you establish a certain number of criteria for which people to get lesser airport security screening, you're inviting terrorists to do whatever it takes to meet those criteria, whether it means joining Global Entry or developing a frequent flyer program. So why do it?
I think there's a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think that the construct set up after 9/11 was a valid model and approach to address the concerns about a follow-on attack and something similar to the 9/11 hijackers. All the multiple layers of security that have been put in since then have strengthened our overall security to the point, and particularly with secure flight, knowing about each passenger more so, that I think given those multiple layers of security, that we have an opportunity to change the paradigm, to look at it in a new and different way, to try to apply some more common sense to the process, to say, okay, if you're Tom Frank and we know something about you because you have shared that information with us, you may be a terrorist. And you will still get some physical screening, but we've done a lot of information screening, if you will, before you ever get to the checkpoint. And so if you want to exploit that system, we will still have opportunities, again, hopefully through that whole intelligence continuum that I discussed, and the law enforcement, all those, that somebody would come up on radar in some respect. That being said, because what we're doing involves additional information sharing, we want to make sure the traveling public is comfortable with that. And that's why we're doing proofs of concept. So if something happens in this proof of concept over the next several months, then we'll go back, recalibrate, and say, okay, maybe it's not going to work because somebody wants to exploit it, whether for drug trafficking or whatever it may be. So it is something that I want to try to manage expectations, to say this is not a snap your finger. We've been doing it one way for 10 years, so starting in September we're going to do it a completely different way. It will be a longer-term build, and the more information, intelligence we can gather, including verifying that you are the person you say you are, the better off we'll be.
But as you acknowledge, there's not going to be any...
Maybe I'll get one question, I don't know.
It seems that what you're talking about is letting a bunch of people who probably have access to an exclusive lane already because they're frequent flyers keep their shoes on, and in exchange for that, you're creating what could be a horrible vulnerability. I'm not sure why it's in the country's interest to let frequent flyers keep their shoes on when you're creating the risk of frequent terrorists keeping their shoes on as well.
So since Richard Reed, December 23rd of 2001, we in the U.S. have screened over 5.5 billion people, no shoe bombers. Now you could say, well, that's because we require shoes to come off. The European Union, 27 countries don't require shoes to come off. You can keep your shoes on there, as many of you know. No shoe bombers there. Globally, over 15 billion people have been screened since 9/11, no shoe bombers. So part of this risk mitigation, again, is to do just that. It doesn't eliminate risk, just like our current setup does not eliminate risk because it's not a perfect system. So can we go about it in a more informed fashion to try to recognize that the vast majority of people traveling every day are not terrorists? Hopefully, those multiple layers of security that I've talked about will identify that putative terrorist before they ever get to the checkpoint, and we'll have that opportunity, just as we see in many of the FBI sting operations, even though they're not aviation related. People who aspirationally want to do something, blow up a courthouse, a Christmas tree lighting ceremony, a subway, real plot with Zazi, any of those things, hopefully those will be on somebody else's radar before it comes down to the minimum of TSA.
If I could follow up on his question, the travel industry has pushed very hard for a trusted traveler program. Was that a factor in your decision to go ahead with this?
So I saw the opportunity for a partnership there, but it really gets back to my background and the opportunity given technology advances, particularly with secure flight, and looking at things that we can't deal with every possible risk. If we do that, especially on the cargo side, we would literally shut down the global supply chain. After the Yemen cargo plot, I met with the leaders of the World Customs Organization, the Universal Postal Union, the International Maritime Organization, all people with a vested interest in cargo. And what I heard from them is the restrictions we put on cargo post-Yemen in that immediate period cost industry the same amount as the Iceland volcano from the spring of 2010. So we have a very dramatic impact on not only global supply things, but jobs and businesses. So part of it is recognizing that if we can work more smartly and with more information, we can do a better job of facilitating those who pose no threat and identify those who do pose a threat.
Another one, right here in front, in the black shirt.
Thanks. I'm Tim Patos. I'm a director with IBM. I run our threat prediction and prevention group. I live on an airplane and have chairman status with several airlines, so wherever the application is, sign me up. Just being able to get up to the front of the line is worth its weight of gold if anyone's ever flown through Chicago on a Friday afternoon. But I have two questions, actually, which are unrelated. So the first one is, since there are a number of frequent flyer folks who live on airplanes and are patriots for the country as well, has there been any consideration given to leveraging the experience of some of these frequent flyers who would be willing to, and who are very keen in noticing anomalies in behavior as well around flights, around how people are acting on airplanes, around how people are going through lines? Because many of us work in this field and might have that acuity to at least see something, say something, to make that more formal. So that's the first question.
Yes is the answer to that one. Very open to that.
Well, can't you do it now with a flight attendant if you see something?
Certainly, but it doesn't seem like it's very formalized. Right? I can certainly go up and talk to a flight attendant or a TSA officer or one of the uniformed officers who are around, but maybe with a little bit more training and greater lines of communication. It seems to be there'll be a lot of knowledge that you could harvest from folks who are going through the air systems constantly.
I did that very thing last week with a 3 million mile flyer. You may be well beyond that, but he had a lot of good insights. So I would say I'm open to suggestion ideas on how this whole risk-based security, known traveler, trusted travel would work. And so if you have thoughts and ideas like that, I'm very much open to that and would appreciate those. We do behavior detection training for flight crew, obviously, and then of course with the federal fire, the pilots who are armed, obviously they have a lot of experience in that regard.
I think what's being suggested here is a more formalized kind of program, separate apart from that.
Yeah, and I'll take that back and look at it, yeah.
So, just a thought. Second question. We spent most of this conversation, of course, focused on passenger security, but in the wake of WikiLeaks and the Fort Hood shootings and that sort of thing, how concerned is TSA about insider threat right now? And what kind of techniques and securities do you have around crew vetting, getting TWIC cards for people to work in the airport, hazmat, things like that?
So the insider threat is a significant concern, of course, globally, but also in the U.S. in case somebody is able to get access, and that's why we have a stringent background process for anybody who would receive what's known as a SIDA card, gives them access to the security area, the airports, the transportation worker identification card, the TWIC card, anybody with ports and other areas, the hazmat material endorsement for the truck drivers. Those individuals all go through a fairly stringent, of course, criminal background and other things. So that's part of it. We also do, in some airports, we do 100% staff screening for those individuals. The bad news is that many individuals who have access currently have access to bad things that are, of course, prohibited items for a passenger to carry through, but could be used to do something to an aircraft, which is part of the challenge. So there's several challenges there that we are aware of. We work very closely with airport law enforcement and obviously the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the entire community to say, Are there people coming up on your radar? And we have had some successes, both in the UK and here in the U.S., about people who have had access, didn't have current access other than the UK, but have had prior access. They were trying to exploit that. But they came up on radar, and investigations were done, and they were taken off.
I think I saw someone in the back there with way back there. Is that you, Sean?
Sean Waterman from the Washington Times. A couple of questions. Could you say a little bit more about the unionization issue? Are you saying that it will improve staff morale? Secondly, I wonder if you could say a little bit about your relations with Congress, and in particular, John Micah, who's the chairman of the Oversight Committee, has been very critical about your decision to stop the opt-out, the partnership program, where airports could opt out of using TSA staff and get private companies to do that. Has that been, could you just say a little bit about those issues?
So on the first issue, many people may not realize that out of the 47,000 or so security officers that people think of at the checkpoints, when I became the administrator last July, there were already 13,000 of those people paying union dues to one of two unions without any collective bargaining authority. So there was a frustration that they could have something more if they had collective bargaining. That being said, my decision was to allow them simply to vote on whether they wanted to have collective bargaining with a particular union. Out of that vote, I think about 19,000 security officers voted. 3,000 plus voted for no union. The other 28,000 or so didn't vote. I don't know what their opinions were. And it was a very close vote between the two unions. There was a runoff election. And I would say that the Federal Labor Relations Authority had ordered an election without regard to collective bargaining. So last November, they ordered that we hold an election without regard to collective bargaining. It was right for exclusive representation. My point was that makes no sense to have exclusive representation if there's not an opportunity for collective bargaining. So in my determination, which I'd encourage you to read if you haven't, it goes into great detail as to what items would be subject to collective bargaining simply at the national level, no local, 450 different bargaining units, and then the specific items such as the shifts, the uniforms, and things like that. Nothing about pay, about benefits beyond the normal, so things like that. So that's one part. And so they voted, for AFG, and so we're in the process of transitioning to say, here's what we'll do, which I think will help us in terms of uniformity, consistency in how we go about really what I would describe as the administrative functions for a large dispersed organization. And so that's what I hope to get out of that. On your second question about Congress, obviously, just as with the traveling public, there are a lot of different opinions among the traveling public of how well TSA does or does not do. A lot of different opinions on the Hill, which I am able to have the opportunity to engage with on a fairly frequent basis, to hear those views and to discuss what my vision is for the agency and where I want to take it and what some of those things mean. So without going into detail as to any particular member, I respect each member's views and want to work closely with each member to try to achieve the best outcomes that provide for the security of the traveling public.
Congressman Micah contends that the screeners at those privatized airports perform better than your screeners do. What's the latest empirical evidence?
So there's 16 airports out of the 450 that are privatized, San Francisco being the largest, Kansas City, 7 in Montana, and some other places. And so when we either do a review or IG, the Inspector General or GAO, it comes out very even in terms of the security aspects and then also the customer satisfaction. So my issue on that has been that the privatized force cost more. So it's been anywhere from 3 to 18% more for the U.S. government, for taxpayers to pay. And so unless I saw a clear and convincing reason to have privatized. My default position is that TSA should be a federal counterterrorism workforce.
And the trend line on the testing of your screeners, some of the numbers have been pretty amazing and appalling when you see the number of bomb components or faux bomb components that sometimes get through a checkpoint during the red team tests. Are your screeners getting better?
Yes, and we recognize that we can always learn from the covert testing that is done. But the most recent covert testing found that our security officers were doing better in 3 categories, which I won't go into detail. And so I'm encouraged by that, but recognizing that we always need to be doing better.
Let's try and squeeze in one more question. Over here?
Thank you. David Trulio, Raytheon Company. Our topic, of course, has been aviation security today. TSA's purview extends beyond aviation. I was hoping you could take a brief moment to describe your efforts and challenges in bus and rail and how that ties in with aviation. Thank you.
So our efforts as it relates to mass transit, of course, outside of aviation, is really to be a force multiplier for the state and locals, Amtrak's of the world that have the first and primary responsibility for safety and security. And we do that through several different ways. One is training, additional training, perhaps through canine programs. It may be through infrastructure protection, so where we would actually pay to harden a target, if you will. And so there's been hundreds of millions of dollars put into those projects, primarily through transportation security grant funds, which are being reduced in the current congressional discussion and things. So it really has a force multiplier. Recognizing TSA, we can't be all places at all times to all people for all threats. So how can we best leverage the local capabilities? They know the threat better than anybody. They know their territory. Amtrak does a great job with vapor wake canines, which we are also working with. They do a great job in uniform patrols, recognizing the terrorists are dissuaded by uniformed officers, canines, and CCTV, being the 3 most common, unless you're a suicide bomber, like we saw with the 7/7 bombers in London. One of the 5 bombers looked at one of the CCTVs before walking into the tube because he knew in 10 minutes he was going to be dead along with everybody else. And so that's the only caveat on that. So we work to enhance their local efforts on that.
Just one really quick one at the end. Do you feel like you're between a rock and a hard place? You get criticized for being too aggressive about security, but if something happens, you're criticized for not doing enough.
That sounds
right?
like a trick question. No, obviously, it's a challenging job. What I've been impressed with is the fact that we have nearly 1.8 million people and more travel every day, and there are no bombs that are getting on planes. We seize on average, or we detect on average, 5 guns every day.
And what's with that?
Well, so most people forgot that they were carrying. That's their story. They're sticking with it. But I think, and drug couriers, and so all the things that are not cause catastrophic failure to aircraft, but are not in the interest of society. So, yeah, the bottom line is the men and women of TSA are there to protect you, everybody here, your loved ones every day. If they do have, if you do have positive experience, if you tell them. If not, I was going to say let me know, but don't do that. But look, we need to improve. We're doing everything possible using the best training techniques enabled by the best technology, and it is a challenging job.
Administrator Pistole, thanks so much for joining
Jeanne,
us
thank
today.
you very much.
We're all flying home, so keep us safe.